The alums will name one after me. Say you already have, Mr. Burrow. That's why they're called hamburgers.
Remember the worst mall restaurants? The ones that faded into history while we barely noticed? Back then, they were weekend rituals, greasy trays, fried cheese, and food court buzz. But when the malls went quiet, did we lose more than just forgettable meals? York Steakhouse was one of those places where the name alone made it sound fancier than it had any right to be. You would walk into this mall steakhouse expecting a polished experience, maybe something upscale, or at least decent. What you got instead was a dark, cafeteria-style dining setup, plastic trays, and a tough-as-leather piece of meat that came swimming in brown mystery sauce. The York branding leaned heavily into colonial imagery, but all it really served was dated design, gray cuts of beef, and the vibe of a hospital lunch line. For a steakhouse, the meat was somehow always the worst part. Even the baked potatoes were wrapped in aluminum and tasted like they had been microwaved twice. It was like someone had taken the idea of a steak dinner and stripped it of all joy. And yet, in the 1970s and 1980s, you could not find a mall without one. It became a family dinner default, not because it was good, but because it was there. Parents liked the price point, kids tolerated the food, and no one really asked for seconds. The real kicker? It faded not because people moved on, but because the illusion broke. Malls started upgrading, food tastes changed, and the idea of eating something that felt like it came from a school cafeteria just lost its appeal. In the end, York Steakhouse became a punchline in the story of mall food, and honestly, it earned that spot. The only thing heavier than the batter at Arthur Treachers was the feeling in your stomach after eating there. This place tried hard to sell a British pub vibe, all while being crammed between a pretzel stand and a Claire's accessories. The fish came out greasy and steaming, wrapped in that weird paper that always seemed damp. It was thick, oily, and more chew than crunch, and that was if you got lucky. On off days, which seemed to be most days, the fish would either be undercooked or so fried it could snap in half like a cracker. The fries, or chips as they insisted, were soggy and pale, always one step away from mashed potatoes. But during the 1970s, Arthur Treachers had real momentum. It was everywhere, fueled by novelty and a kind of fast food nationalism. After all, what was more American than importing something and giving it a greasy spin? But the truth is, the food quality never held up. People caught on, and the British gimmick stopped working when the flavor failed to follow through. Eventually, other fish spots moved in with better recipes and fewer apologies. Arthur Treachers became the old man in the mall food court, still handing out paper trays while the rest of the world moved on to sushi and smoothies. It faded not with a bang, but with the slow, damp hiss of fryer oil past its prime. Rack's roast beef wanted to be the cooler Arby's, and maybe for a second it was. But when your brand identity bounces between roast beef, salad bars, baked potatoes, and something called pizza pockets, things tend to unravel. At first glance, Rack's seemed like a good idea. Roast beef sandwiches that felt a little more adult, a little more upscale. Then you walked in and saw a decor that looked like a corporate waiting room, complete with faux wood paneling and an overzealous fern in the corner. The food was never terrible, but it was never good either. The roast beef tasted like it had been steam-sealed in plastic, and everything else felt like it came straight from the freezer section. The salad bar? Always kind of sad. Brown-edged lettuce, rock-hard cherry tomatoes, and ranch dressing that tasted faintly of glue. It was like eating dinner in a basement office. Rack's made the classic mistake of trying to be everything to everyone, and ended up pleasing no one. What really sealed its fate, though, was its attempt to go luxury. Glass walls, mood lighting, and booths that looked like they belonged in a dentist's waiting room. Customers just wanted a decent sandwich, not a failed midlife crisis in restaurant form. Rack's roast beef never figured out who it was, and so the mall crowd moved on, quietly but completely. Orange Julius started out as a pure joy drink, sweet, frothy, cold, and refreshing. You would grab one on a hot mall day and instantly feel like you were holding a little bit of sunshine. But somewhere along the way, the wheels fell off. The drinks got inconsistent, sometimes too watery, sometimes so sweet your teeth would ache. Then they added food, bad food. Hot dogs that tasted like they had been microwaved in plastic wrap, nachos with that nuclear cheese that hardened like cement in minutes, and corn dogs that never really seemed cooked through. Nobody wanted that from Orange Julius. It was supposed to be a treat, not a last resort. But the franchise tried to grow too wide too fast. And with each new mall location, quality took a hit. You would start to see their signs flickering, their counters covered in sticky residue, and that once iconic orange swirl faded to a dull blur. They were eventually absorbed into Dairy Queen, but by then, most people had already moved on. The decline of Orange Julius was like watching a childhood favorite lose its spark. It hurt, but it also made sense. You can only water something down so many times before it just disappears. Hot Sam Pretzels was the original king of the food court carb fix, before Auntie Anne swept the stage with cinnamon sugar and buttery salt. You could smell Hot Sam from halfway down the mall, a buttery, bready scent that made you think of warmth, even if the pretzel itself was usually lukewarm at best. The idea was simple, giant, soft pretzels. But the execution? Not so great. The dough often felt dense and dry, like it had been sitting under a heat lamp for hours. The salt would clump in one corner and completely skip the rest of the pretzel. They tried to innovate too, offering bizarre toppings like cheddar dust or pizza sauce, but it just felt desperate. The pretzels were oddly chewy, sometimes even crunchy in the wrong places. And while kids might have still tugged at their parents for one, adults started to pass them by. Hot Sam suffered from being first, but not necessarily best. They could not keep up with newer chains that offered fresher bakes and actual consistency. Eventually, most Hot Sam pretzels either shut down or got replaced by, you guessed it, Auntie Anne's. A sad end for what was once a classic mall snack. You never forget your first pretzel, but you also never want to go back when the memory tastes better than the food ever did. Zantiggo was the taco place you went to when Taco Bell was either full or closed. They promised a different kind of fast Mexican food, with slightly better ingredients and less chaotic branding. But it never really clicked. The food was always just messy. Tacos that collapsed in your hands, cheese that hardened in minutes, and burritos that somehow leaked before you even unwrapped them. Their standout item was the chilito, a cheesy meat tube that sounded more like a dare than a meal, and it showed. Zantiggo never figured out how to stand apart from Taco Bell, despite claiming they did things better. That claim fell apart fast when you took a bite and ended up with orange sauce on your jeans. At its core, Zantiggo felt like a fast food chain trying to act grown up while still serving high school cafeteria food. The problem? No one really asked for that. It got bought out by Taco Bell, absorbed, and erased from most malls without even a goodbye sign. Today, it exists only in memory and the occasional nostalgic forum post. Zantiggo promised a zesty future, but delivered lukewarm leftovers. Beefsteak Charlie's was less of a restaurant and more of a punchline wrapped in unlimited sangria. What started as a quirky steakhouse idea quickly mutated into a budget buffet experiment that leaned hard on slogans like, "You are going to get spoiled." Spoiled was right. The food was greasy, lukewarm, and constantly underwhelming. The steak? Thin, chewy, and suspiciously shiny. The seafood? Usually overcooked or barely thawed. The buffet spread looked like it had been left out too long, because it had. You would find stale rolls, jiggly jello, and pasta drowning in a sea of butter substitute. Still, people came. Why? Because they offered unlimited everything, beer, wine, and ribs included. But unlimited does not mean good. As the 1980s rolled on, malls tried to upgrade their image, and Beefsteak Charlie's stood out in all the wrong ways. Dim lighting, carpet that smelled like old grease, and a menu that felt like a dare more than a dining option. Eventually, the mall chains closed up, unable to compete with cleaner, sharper competitors. Charlie might have promised the world, but he left a lot of people with just indigestion. Delights of America was the kind of place that tried to sell healthy fast food before people even knew what that meant. You walked in expecting something revolutionary. What you got was a dry, rubbery burger with half the flavor and none of the charm. This was the 1980s after all. People were still figuring out what fat-free and low-calorie even tasted like, and Delights decided to teach them the hard way. Their burgers used lean meat, sometimes even soy fillers, and the buns felt like they had been stored in a gym locker. The milkshakes were made with skim milk and artificial sweeteners, which gave them the texture of melted chalk. Their selling point was that everything had fewer calories, but they never figured out how to make those calories count. Delights had the tone of a fitness infomercial and the flavor of cardboard. It made people feel guilty for craving taste. Eventually, people realized they could eat better at home, and with more flavor too. The chain flamed out fast, forgotten in a wave of rising fast casual giants that offered healthy without sacrifice. Delights tried to run before anyone knew what a power walk was. Woov's hamburgers leaned hard into the idea of love. Cute name, heart-shaped branding, and signs that looked like a greeting card. But step inside, and that love disappeared fast. The burgers were oddly sweet, the buns were mushy, and the interiors felt like someone designed them after watching too many low-budget sitcoms. Founded in the 1970s, Woov's was Florida's take on fast food charm. But charm can only go so far when your food tastes like confusion. One of their big draws was a build-your-own topping station, but it quickly turned into a germy mess. By the 1980s, Woov's was already in trouble. They had rapid expansion with no clear identity and worse, no loyal customers. People could not figure out if it was for kids, health nuts, or burger traditionalists. And when your name is Woov's, you better deliver something memorable. Unfortunately, it was the kind of place you remembered for all the wrong reasons. Woov's faded without a fight, replaced by stronger chains and cleaner branding. But hey, at least they tried to show a little heart. Mr. Dunderbacks was the mall food court's idea of going European. Picture this: faux German decor, a menu full of bratwurst and schnitzel, and a name that sounded like a cartoon character. The idea was to make you feel like you were eating in a Bavarian beer hall, but in practice, it felt more like Oktoberfest in a storage closet. The sausages were salty and rubbery. The sauerkraut tasted like it came from a can that had been opened the week before. And everything came served on a brown plastic tray that made you question your life choices. The atmosphere tried to be jolly, with servers in vaguely German uniforms, but mostly it just made you feel embarrassed to be holding a paper cup of lukewarm root beer while polka music played in the background. Mr. Dunderbacks had some early success because there was nothing quite like it. But once the novelty wore off, it was hard to justify eating boiled cabbage in a mall when you could get pizza instead. Slowly but surely, they disappeared. Another victim of malls moving on and people realizing they did not need lederhosen with their lunch. Chongqing Chicken had a name that sounded like a joke your older cousin whispered when the adults weren't listening. The branding was bold and brash: cartoon chickens, flames, and bright red signs promising heat levels you could barely survive. It tried to make spicy food seem extreme and fun, but the reality was far messier. The chicken was greasy, dry in the middle, and coated in sauces that often tasted like watered-down hot wing experiments. You could go for thermonuclear heat, but most people tapped out after one bite and a whole lot of regret. Their signature wings came with more attitude than flavor, and the rest of the menu felt like an afterthought. Sandwiches were overloaded, fries were limp, and the interiors always seemed like they were halfway through a renovation they forgot to finish. It did well near college campuses for a while, mostly because students will eat just about anything if it's cheap and spicy. But in malls, it never quite fit. The attitude clashed with the family-friendly vibe, and the food didn't hold up when you weren't a broke 20-year-old craving punishment. Chongqing was trying too hard to be edgy in a place where people just wanted lunch. Eventually, most locations fizzled out, leaving behind empty storefronts and a legacy of burned tongues. Pup and Taco might be one of the most confusing names to ever hit the fast food scene. Are you getting a hot dog? Are you getting a taco? And why would those two things live under the same roof? In the 1970s, Pup and Taco tried to make it make sense, offering a grab bag menu of hot dogs, tacos, burgers, and burritos, all delivered with a side of neon signage and no real identity. The tacos were dry, loaded with orange cheese and iceberg lettuce that wilted on contact. The hot dogs were basic at best, often lukewarm and drowned in mustard or mystery chili. It was the kind of place where everything looked right on the tray but fell apart after the first bite. Still, there was something weirdly lovable about it, especially if you were a kid. You could order like you were at a buffet line for carnival food, but the charm wore off fast. As mall food courts modernized and cleaned up their acts, Pup and Taco felt like the odd uncle who still wore bell-bottoms to a barbecue. Taco Bell eventually bought them out and absorbed their locations, leaving little more than a memory behind. If you remember Pup and Taco, you probably also remember wondering why you ever thought chili cheese on a tortilla was a good idea. All-American Burger should have been an easy win. It had the name, the branding, and even a cameo in a cult classic movie. But being featured in Fast Times at Ridgemont High was probably the peak of its cultural relevance. The food itself, very hit or miss, burgers that were under-seasoned and overcooked, buns that seemed like they had been pulled from a middle school lunch tray, and fries that had the tragic texture of something once frozen, never loved. All-American Burger wanted to be the patriotic fast food answer to McDonald's. Home-style burgers, fries, and shakes, all made fresh and proudly served. But pride only goes so far when you're biting into a dry slab of meat that needs 3 napkins just to get through. The ambiance was plain, often verging on sterile. No real vibe, no unique flavor, just red, white, and beige. Malls gave them space because the name sounded good and safe. But customers were looking for more than a good name. They were looking for a reason to come back. That reason never really arrived. One by one, All-American Burger locations closed, casualties of a food court war they never had the heart to fight. Po folks made no secret about what it was. From the name to the decor to the menu, everything screamed homespun, down-home, and deeply fried. It was Southern comfort food designed for mall diners, with checkered tablecloths, wooden signs, and servers in gingham shirts. But the vibe was not the problem. The food was. Chicken that was always a little too greasy, mashed potatoes that tasted like powdered mix with a stick of margarine thrown in, and cornbread so dry it could double as kindling. Po Folks sold itself on authenticity, but it often felt like a parody of country cooking, like someone read about the South in a book and built a restaurant from that. During its peak, it was a hit with families. Affordable, filling, and easy to understand. But as food trends shifted and diners expected a little more finesse, Po Folks got left behind. The decor became dated. The charm started to wear off. And people started realizing that cheap and comforting do not always belong in the same sentence. One day, you just looked around and noticed it was gone. The rocking chairs, the fried okra, the namesake pride, it all faded just like the folks it tried to honor. The Magic Pan had one job: make crepes cool. And for a little while it did. With its open kitchen design and spinning crepe pans, it felt like watching food get made in a science experiment or a fairy tale. There was this glass-windowed charm about it. But beneath the novelty was a menu that just did not hold up. The crepes themselves were thin, yes, but often rubbery. The fillings leaned heavy on canned sauces, processed cheese, and meats that were more salt than substance. Sweet crepes came overloaded with syrupy fruit that tasted suspiciously like pie filling from a tin. At first, mall-goers were dazzled. It felt special, a step above the ordinary fast food noise. But crepes are delicate, and mass production is not. Over time, the food lost its luster. The quality slipped. The spectacle no longer distracted from the taste. The Magic Pan eventually disappeared from malls, a victim of its own limitations. You can only spin so many crepes before people realize the magic was mostly smoke. Schraft's was not just a mall restaurant. It was once a New York institution, a place where ladies lunched and chocolate sundaes had silver spoons. But by the time it reached the mall food court, it was a faded photograph of its former self. What had been elegant became cafeteria grade. You would order a turkey sandwich and get deli meat on soggy white bread. The salads were limp, the soup tepid, and the desserts cloying rather than charming. The atmosphere tried to hint at mid-century glamour, but it felt more like your grandma's basement trying to be fancy. Schrafft's could not evolve. As malls filled with fast food and international flavor, Schrafft's stuck with its tea room nostalgia and hoped someone would care. Most people did not. Younger generations had no idea what it was supposed to be, and older ones remembered it differently, better. So it vanished. A relic that could not find footing in a world that had moved on from tuna melts and formal pie carts. Schrafft's was a place out of time, and eventually out of malls entirely. Gino's Hamburgers had one of the strongest starts in the fast food game, co-founded by a football star and full of big ambition. For a while, it looked like it might even outshine McDonald's. The food was classic Americana, burgers, fries, and shakes, all rolled into a simple, satisfying package. But Gino's got greedy. They expanded fast, partnered with the Kentucky Fried Chicken brand, and lost focus. The menu became bloated, the branding muddled, and the food took a hit. Suddenly, your burger came out half cold. Your fries tasted like chicken grease, and everything just felt off. Customers noticed. The once loyal crowd moved on, and Gino's never recovered. In malls, the brand suffered most. With foot traffic shrinking and competition rising, Gino's could not offer anything new. It faded slowly, leaving behind little more than a name people kind of remembered and a logo that belonged to another time. Today you might still find an old wrapper or a nostalgic fan page, but the burgers are long gone. And maybe that is for the best. Quick Wok was fast food Chinese, done with all the care and none of the flavor. It promised hot, ready Asian cuisine, lo mein, fried rice, egg rolls, orange chicken, all served up fast and cheap. But speed was not the problem. The problem was that every dish tasted like it came from the same bland vat. The rice was always a little too wet or a little too dry. The noodles stuck together in lumps. The vegetables were overcooked. The sauces were either overly sweet or had zero flavor, and the chicken had that too smooth texture that made you question reality. It looked okay behind the glass counter, with the steam rising and the trays shining under heat lamps. But one bite in, and you knew you had made a mistake. Quick Wok thrived briefly on convenience. Malls needed variety, and Asian food seemed like a great addition. But as real competition arrived, places that actually cooked fresh or had some authenticity, Quick Wok faded fast. You can only survive on fortune cookies and two-item combos for so long. Eventually, customers stopped showing up, and the only thing left was the smell of sweet and sour sauce and an empty register drawer. H. Salt Fish and Chips was a strange little blip in the mall food universe. A British-style seafood place that leaned hard on the authentic label, even though nothing tasted like it came from across the pond. The fish was oily and dense, more like a sponge dipped in fryer oil than anything flaky or fresh. The chips were limp and mealy, and the tartar sauce came in foil-topped cups that looked and tasted like plastic. H. Salt wanted to feel upscale, with a fancier name and a different menu, but the execution landed somewhere between school cafeteria and boardwalk regret. At its worst, it was just expensive grease. At its best, it was still not great. Malls gave it space because it looked different. A seafood option, something unique. But in practice, most people walked past it in favor of something that did not make the food court smell like a fish market. Over time, the novelty wore off, and so did the patience. H. Salt is one of those places you remember in a blur, a blurry sign, a blurrier menu, and a memory of one very disappointing lunch. Neon Pretzel looked like a food stand designed by a rave. Bright colors, loud signs, and pretzels with even louder flavors. On paper, it was a fun twist on a mall classic. But in practice, the pretzels were dry, the cheese sauces were straight from a can, and the whole experience felt like it came with a headache. They offered things like jalapeno cheddar, cinnamon crunch, or garlic butter swirl, all of which sounded amazing until you actually tried them. The toppings were uneven, the dough was stiff, and nothing tasted as fresh as it looked. Neon Pretzel banked on being the cool new thing in the snack scene. But the truth is, people want a pretzel that feels warm and soft, not one that crumbles or feels synthetic. Compared to Auntie Anne's, it stood no chance. The branding was loud, but the product was weak. You would try it once, maybe twice, then never again. Eventually, most locations blinked out, just like their overlit signs. Neon Pretzel was a product of its time, and a reminder that style means nothing if the snack falls flat. The original Kasab Bonita was a full-blown experience, a theme park masquerading as a restaurant, complete with cliff divers, cave rooms, and a full sensory overload. But when they tried shrinking that down into mall locations, the magic disappeared fast. Gone were the theatrics and elaborate sets. What you got instead was a dingy corner spot serving underwhelming tacos and lukewarm enchiladas under buzzing fluorescent lights. The food had always been a little beside the point at Kasab Bonita, but in the mall version, it became the only point, and it was not strong enough to stand alone. The beans were bland, the rice dry, and everything came smothered in a sauce that tasted like regret. You could not hide the lack of flair behind a plate of soggy nachos. People came expecting a slice of spectacle, and what they got was a cafeteria lunch with fake palm trees. The brand had built itself on wonder, but when you strip that away, all you are left with is average food and a weird name. Kasab Bonita's mall outlets tried to cash in on the original's fame, but without the magic tricks, it was just another underperforming Mexican chain. The crowds stopped coming, the lights dimmed, and all that was left were memories of what used to be and what never should have been shrunk. Corn Dog 7 was the kind of place you passed by, caught a whiff of fried dough, and instantly remembered you were hungry. But then you bit into it and remembered why you had stopped eating there in the first place. Their corn dogs looked perfect on display. Golden brown, crispy, warm. But the first bite was usually all batter, no dog. The hot dogs were small, often overcooked, and had the snap of a rubber band. The batter itself varied wildly, sometimes too thick, sometimes soggy from sitting too long under a heat lamp. Corn Dog 7 offered lemonade and cheese fries too, but they did not help the situation. The lemonade was often too tart or too sugary, and the fries were limp and dripping with artificial cheese. In a food court full of competition, Corn Dog 7 stood out only because it was so oddly specific. A whole chain built on one item, and that item was rarely made well. People eventually moved on to more filling, more reliable food options. Corn Dog 7 just could not keep up with rising expectations, better snacks, and fresher choices. It faded quietly from malls, taking its neon signs and stubborn grease smell with it. You may not miss the corn dogs, but you probably still remember the logo. Yummies donuts and ice cream sounded like a dream. Who would not want donuts and ice cream in one place, right next to the food court? But the name did more work than the kitchen. The donuts were dry and cakey, often left out just long enough to go stale. They lacked the soft, fresh bite you would expect, and instead crumbled in your hand like old bread. The icing was waxy, the sprinkles clumped, and the fillings tasted like they came from a can marked fruit-flavored goo. As for the ice cream, it was oddly icy, with flavors that felt artificial and one note. Vanilla was too sweet, chocolate too bland. The scoops came out like half-frozen slush, melting in your hand before you made it 5 steps. Yummies leaned into being a treat stop for kids, but the parents paying for it quickly realized it was not worth the price or the sugar crash. The shop tried to appeal with bright colors and retro fonts, but the experience was always more style than substance. In a world where donut shops and creameries were getting better every year, Yummies stayed exactly the same, and that was the problem. Eventually, customers stopped pretending it was a fun idea. The name stayed sweet, but the memories soured. Brezlers Ice Cream had a simple pitch. Good old-fashioned ice cream, right in the mall. For a time, it worked. The bright counters, the hard-packed tubs of brightly colored flavors, and the smell of waffle cones all pulled you in. But once you got your scoop, reality hit. The flavors were safe: chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, but never exceptional. The texture was sometimes chalky, sometimes gummy. And the toppings? Sparse and stiff like they had been sitting out all day. Brezlers never managed to stand out against the rising tide of gourmet scoops and trendy mix-ins. By the time brands like Cold Stone and Ben and Jerry's made their way into malls, Brezlers looked old, tired, and way too plain. They tried to modernize, but it felt forced. New logos, but the same uninspired product. Kids liked it well enough, but adults could taste the corners being cut. Eventually, other dessert spots outpaced them. The counters closed, the flavors disappeared, and all that remained was the memory of a cone that melted faster than it impressed. Brezlers was the kind of place you tolerated, until something better opened 2 stores down. Treats was exactly what it sounded like, and somehow that was the problem. No one really knew what it was. Was it a candy shop, a dessert bar, a snack station? The menu changed depending on the location, but usually included a mix of soft serve, frozen yogurt, novelty candy, and the occasional slushy machine. But nothing really stood out. The yogurt was thin and sour, the cones stale, and the toppings came in dusty plastic bins that always looked half empty. The candy section was uninspired, mostly generic brands or gummy worms hardened from sitting too long under the lights. Even the signage felt like an afterthought. Bright colors, basic fonts, and a name that sounded like a placeholder. Treats had no identity, no standout item, and no reason to visit unless every other food court spot was closed. Parents would drag their kids away from it, teens would skip it, and eventually, the mall did too. It closed quietly with barely anyone noticing. The name might have promised something fun, but all it ever delivered was disappointment. Treats was the empty calories of mall dining, forgettable, avoidable, and eventually erased. There was a time when Burger Chef was everywhere. We are talking thousands of locations, second only to McDonald's. It had that red, white, and blue branding, a fun cartoon mascot, and the kind of meals kids begged for after school. And yet, somehow, it all vanished. Not with a bang, but with a slow, silent collapse. Burger Chef was ahead of its time in a lot of ways. They invented the kids' meal before anyone else, complete with toys and comic book menus. They had the Works Bar, a build-your-own burger station that felt revolutionary back then. People genuinely liked the food. The burgers were solid, the fries had their fans, and the milkshakes were thick enough to bend a spoon. But then the cracks started showing. Management decisions got messy. Franchises started pulling in different directions. While McDonald's was streamlining and branding like crazy, Burger Chef felt stuck in place. They expanded too fast, tried too many new things at once, and lost the clear identity that made them special in the first place. By the late 1970s, competition was fierce, and Burger Chef just could not keep up. Some stores quietly rebranded. Others shut down completely. A few were bought out by Hardee's. And just like that, a name that once stood tall across the country faded into trivia night territory. People still remember those fun meals and commercials, but the chain itself? Gone. A reminder that being first does not mean you win, especially if you do not adapt. Burger Chef had the recipe. They just lost the kitchen. The flea market at the county fairgrounds was not just an event. It was an ecosystem. Hot pavement under your feet, the smell of popcorn mixing with motor oil, and a wall of voices haggling like they were at a medieval bazaar. Dad had a game plan. He always did. First, a lap to scout, then back around to make the real choices. You wandered behind him wide-eyed, marveling at tables full of license plates, rusted tools, vintage comic books, and a surprising amount of questionable homemade jerky. One guy sold nothing but bumper stickers with sayings that would get you sent to the principal's office. Another had rows of toy yo-yos. And even though Dad warned you, you begged for one anyway. It broke in 5 minutes, maybe 6, but you still carried it around like it was gold. There was always a booth with used records blaring classic rock through dusty speakers, and Dad would flip through the crates like he was searching for buried treasure. Every once in a while, he would hold one up and say, "Now this is music." You did not argue. Not when he looked that happy. And if you thought flea markets were a lawless land of loose change and sunburns, just wait until you hear about the go-kart track that somehow never got shut down. In the 1970s, Vivitar cameras were everywhere. They were not the fanciest, but they worked. They captured birthday parties, backyard barbecues, and road trips to Mount Rushmore. They were affordable, sturdy, and proudly American. For amateur photographers, Vivitar was a ticket to creativity. But behind the shutters and flashbulbs, the world was changing. Japan was coming fast with brands like Nikon, Canon, and Minolta. Their lenses were sharper, their designs sleeker, and their technology more advanced. Vivitar could not keep up. It tried to pivot, offering accessories, licensing deals, and budget versions of premium cameras. Every shelf they lost in a department store was one less memory they would help capture. They were not just losing market share, they were losing their place in the family album. But the market was ruthless. Film was expensive, competition was brutal, and Vivitar slowly fell out of focus. By the time digital cameras arrived, it was too late. What once filled shelves at Sears and Montgomery Ward now sat in garage sales and thrift stores. Forgotten. But ask anyone who grew up in the 1970s to show you their old photo albums. Odds are, a Vivitar helped make those memories. A camera might just be a tool, but for millions of Americans, Vivitar was how they remembered their lives. Lewis's Lunch in New Haven, Connecticut, was opened after the days of Antoine and Parker's Findings, though it was still around when they were kicking. First touching American soil in 1895, this restaurant is special, even among this list of industry pioneers and innovators. Why is that so? Because, well, if a hamburger has helped you at any point in your life, and I know it's saved me on the worst days of mine, then we both have Lewis's Lunch to thank. The legend goes like this. The founder, Louis Lasson, made the first ever American hamburger when he had to put ground beef between two slices of bread to serve a customer in a big rush. And this caught on so well that it became the format for just about the next 2 centuries for American eating. I mean, I'm sure we'll still be eating hamburgers well into 2095. The simplicity of Louis' Lunch makes it a knockout with its loyal fan base, who know what they come for and pay to get and are perfectly content with the formula. A very, if it isn't broke, don't fix it kind of approach, but one that's worked well. Keeping ties strong with the loyal customer base you've built is as legitimate a strategy as expanding menus and trying out new experimental foods. And Louis' White Toast and Only Cheese hamburgers are an American classic that will never leave the history books. Pioneer Chicken was not just food, it was a vibe. An LA staple with an orange and red glow that felt like it came from another world. The fried chicken here was unlike anything else. Its signature reddish-brown coating almost looked radioactive, but once you bit into that ultra-crispy skin, you got it. Tender chicken inside, wild crunch on the outside, and just enough seasoning to make you reach for a napkin between bites. People loved Pioneer because it was loud, bold, and unapologetically messy. And if you were anywhere near Los Angeles during the 1980s, you could not miss it. With Dodgers memorabilia on the walls and that blazing neon signage out front, it was practically a sports bar disguised as a fast food joint. It was the kind of place you hit up after a game, or on a late-night fried chicken run with your cousins. Eventually, though, the fried chicken wars heated up, and Pioneer could not keep up. Locations closed, memories faded, and only a few die-hard fans kept the dream alive. But once you have tasted that crunch, it stays with you. Speaking of flavor bombs, let us head to a place that steamed their hot dogs and beer and served tiki cocktails next to vinyl booths, an odd pairing that somehow made perfect sense. Now technically, Kenny Rogers Roasters did not take off until the 1990s, but its roots were planted much earlier, and that is where the story gets interesting. Back in the 1970s, there were already whispers of bringing home-style roasted chicken into the fast food space. But the timing? Office way off. People in the 70s were not exactly racing toward health-conscious choices. Fried chicken ruled. Burgers were booming. Salads were more of a garnish than a main event. So, the idea of wood-fired rotisserie chicken, slow-roasted sides, and low-grease meals just did not click. It was a decade too soon for that kind of thinking. And even though Kenny Rogers himself was a megastar, Grammy winner, chart topper, absolute icon, not even his name could have carried a concept like that in the age of milkshakes and deep fryers. Roasters stayed more of a loose concept through the 70s and 80s, not really finding its legs until health food finally entered the mainstream. When the chain finally launched in the 90s, it got some traction. People liked the rotisserie vibe. It even got its own Seinfeld episode. But its foundation, that slower, gentler approach to fast food, never really meshed with the hustle of the drive-thru culture that had already taken over 2 decades earlier. By then, it was always playing catch-up. A good idea, born in the wrong decade and never quite able to roast its way into legend. The all-you-can-fit junkyard was not a store. It was a scavenger hunt with tetanus on the side. Dad would wear his work pants, which meant they had oil stains older than you were, and he would grab a wrench like he was Indiana Jones about to head into the temple. The guy at the front desk waved him through like an old friend. "Take whatever you can carry," he said, and Dad took that as a challenge. Rows and rows of sun-bleached cars with their guts spilled out, broken washing machines, and lawnmowers that had definitely seen war. Dad would pop a hood, grunt like he found treasure, and climb inside the thing like he was becoming one with it. Meanwhile, you were busy poking through the wreckage and came across something unforgettable, an actual raccoon skull. No idea how it got there. You just knew it was going in your backpack. At some point, Dad would emerge, sweaty and victorious, holding a car mirror or some hose that just needed a clean. It was less about the parts and more about the hunt. And when the sun started setting and he said, "We've got time for one more stop," you hoped it would be the fishing hole, the one no one else knew about. In the late 1970s, Vidal Sassoon was more than a brand. It was a movement. The salons, the products, the commercials. If you do not look good, we do not look good. It was bold, sharp, and full of promise. The Vidal Sassoon salons offered high-end haircuts with a modern edge. Women felt transformed. Men took notice. It was more than a trim. It was a lifestyle. You were not just getting a haircut. You were getting modernized, elevated, made new. For many, it was the first time they felt stylish instead of simply presentable. But like many trends, it struggled to evolve. The early 1980s brought new fashion rules, big hair, wild volume. Sassoon's geometric precision began to feel too rigid, too old. Franchises thinned. The elite vibe became a burden, not a benefit. Meanwhile, cheaper salons, home styling kits, and new celebrity stylists flooded the market. The salons faded. The products moved to drugstore shelves. And the name that once meant sophistication became just another bottle in the aisle. But there was a time, brief, electric, when getting your hair done at Vidal Sassoon felt like stepping into the future. And losing that future stung more than people admit. Remember that place I said White Tower copied and got into some franchising issues with? Well, meet the very first to do it, White Castle. First founded in 1921 in Wichita, Kansas, by 2 men, Billy Ingram and Walter Anderson, White Castle was an innovator, and I don't think there was ever a more appropriate use of the word in this entire list. It was known as the first fast food hamburger chain in the United States, period. It also came up with small, square burgers instead of what we typically are used to, and these would later on be called sliders in today's day and age. White Castle wasn't just known for its White Castle-like architecture, which became a huge crux of its branding. It was also known for its really unique method of preparation. The burgers were made with onions and had holes in the patties, and this ensured that the patty was made evenly. The chain was one of the first fast food joints to have standardized food preparation and assembly line techniques, as well as an impeccable standard for hygiene. All in all, it was everything that fast food places today aren't, but a lot of places tried to follow its example back then because this place set the template of fast, convenient, clean, and easy food. White Castle became known for efficiency, simplicity, and a lot of good food. Steak and Ale was the go-to place for when you wanted to feel fancy but still be home in time to catch a rerun of Magnum P.I. With its dark wood Tudor-style decor, stained glass windows, and hushed lighting, it gave off the vibe of a medieval inn. if the inn served salad bars and prime rib. You walked in and immediately felt like you were somewhere upscale. Maybe not 5-star fine dining upscale, but mom's wearing lipstick and dad ironed his shirt upscale. The menu was packed with classics: sirloin steak, grilled salmon, baked potatoes as big as your head, and those tiny warm rolls that you could never get enough of. It made you feel like royalty, piling your plate high before the main course even arrived. For Middle America, steak and ale was the perfect blend of classy and casual. But while it may have been your parents' date night choice, the next place on our list was for the open road, the brightly colored beacon of every interstate exit, and the last orange-roofed symbol of a family vacation. It started with a catchphrase, "Howdy," and a dream to sell Southern fried chicken with country music flair. Minnie Pearl's Fried Chicken was supposed to be the next big thing, with the backing of the famous Grand Ole Opry star herself, but behind the folksy branding was a mess of corporate overreach, bad planning, and one of the biggest busts in fast food history. The chain exploded practically overnight in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Dozens of franchises were sold before the first location even had time to break even. Investors saw dollar signs. Fans of country music thought it sounded charming. And on paper, it should have worked. Southern cooking, fried chicken, recognizable branding. What could go wrong? Well, a lot. The chicken itself was wildly inconsistent. Some locations had juicy, crispy birds. Others served up dry, bland meat that would make Colonel Sanders cry. The real problem, though, was in the books. Poor financial oversight, inflated stock values, and a business model built more on hype than actual product. As soon as the financial reality hit, things unraveled fast. Lawsuits followed, franchises closed, and the dream of a country fried empire went cold before it even had time to settle into the fryer. Minnie Pearl herself had little to do with the chain's day-to-day operations, but her name was forever attached to its downfall. It became a cautionary tale, proof that you cannot build a restaurant brand on personality alone. Fried chicken can be comfort food, but in this case, it became corporate chaos with a Southern twang. Godfathers Pizza was like walking into a gangster movie if the mobsters were all obsessed with deep dish crust and unlimited toppings. From the name to the decor, everything screamed themed dining, but in the best possible way. You stepped through those doors, and suddenly you were not in Kansas anymore. You were in a smoky, red-lit parlor with velvet booths, murals of Italian street scenes, and maybe a booth shaped like a carriage. It was a whole vibe. Families would crowd around wooden tables, pulling apart slices while sipping sodas from chalice-sized cups. The salad bar was an afterthought. This was about indulgence. And while Godfathers never went truly national like some of its competitors, it had a loyal following in the Midwest and beyond. As time passed, the branding got quieter and locations started to vanish, but those who grew up on its chunky crust and Godfather-themed ads still crave a slice. And if Godfathers was the high-drama pizza joint of the 80s, our next destination was a little more reserved, but no less memorable. With Tudor-style walls and steak that came with a side of class, it was the place you dressed up for. Burger Queen Druthers was also known for its mascot, Queenie Bee, and a really simple and affordable menu that was burgers, chicken, and milkshakes. You might be wondering why the name is split into two, though, and, well, they used to be known as Burger Queen, but they changed their name to Druthers eventually. It was an attempt to set itself apart, and it also worked with their new slogan in the 1980s, which was, "I'd rather go to Druthers." Yeah, I can safely say their shakes and burgers were worth your money, but that pun game really needs work. Anyway, they would eventually expand their menu far past items like basic burgers and would include fish sandwiches and fired chicken, which helped boost its popularity enough to give local fast food chains some competition. It unfortunately couldn't keep up with other competitors that were big enough to have a nationwide presence, and the constant attempts at refreshing its image meant that it lost a sense of identity, ironically enough. However, what it did show a lot of other businesses in America was the idea of expanding your menu to include more varied items. This is something places would try to adopt a lot because they saw how it helped Druthers keep up with local competition, so it became a go-to idea for startups and up-and-coming fast food joints. The American Motors Corporation was not supposed to die. It was supposed to be the little guy that held the line. In a market dominated by giants like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, AMC dared to be different. It gave us the Gremlin, the Hornet, and the Pacer, cars that looked like nothing else on the road. But that difference came at a cost. AMC was always scrambling for cash. Its designs were bold, but sometimes too bold. The Pacer was called a fishbowl on wheels. The Gremlin looked like a prank gone too far. And while America was falling in love with fuel efficiency and sleek imports, AMC clung to its oddball identity. It tried to innovate. It partnered with Renault. It launched the Eagle, a car that would inspire the modern SUV. But none of it was enough. The market was cruel. Interest rates climbed. Gas prices jumped. AMC fell behind on everything: production, marketing, even public opinion. By the time Chrysler bought it out in the late 1980s, it was already a ghost. People do not talk much about AMC now, but they should. Because it tried. It really tried. And in the end, that might be what hurts most. Radio Shack. You did not go to Radio Shack to shop. You went there to touch. The moment you walked through the door, it was like stepping onto a spaceship. Racks of wires, batteries, and gadgets you had never even heard of. And in the middle of it all, the demo table, a flashing, beeping paradise. Dad would say, "We're just browsing," but an hour later, he was still pressing buttons, turning knobs, and pretending he was building a satellite in the garage. You would find the mini keyboard and try to play "Mary Had a Little Lamb" while he talked tech with the teenage clerk behind the counter. Every once in a while, he would point at something and say, "I had one of these back in college," even if he definitely did not. He would pick up a transistor radio, weigh it in his hand like a jeweler inspecting a rare gem, and give a long, low whistle. Solid piece of work. He never bought anything over $20, but you always walked out feeling like you had been part of a NASA mission. If imagination had a store, it was that one. And right around the corner from that tech wonderland, a pet store where you begged and somehow always walked out with something in a plastic bag. Before there were apps and fast food at every exit, there was Howard Johnson's, and for a while, it was the place to pull over. Those orange roofs popped out along highways like candy corn, and families knew exactly what they were getting the second they saw one. For travelers in the 1970s, Howard Johnson's was more than just a pit stop. It was a place of comfort, consistency, and ice cream. 28 flavors. That was the magic number. Whether you were 7 or 70, the moment you saw that ice cream counter, your travel fatigue faded. It could be chocolate chip or butter brickle. There was always something waiting to lift your spirits. But Hojo's was not just about dessert. It had a full menu of solid, dependable American fare. Fried clams, hot dogs, grilled cheese sandwiches with that satisfying golden crust. Food that was not trying to impress you, just feed you well. Inside, it was bright, friendly, and always clean. The kind of place where you might hear, "How was the drive?" from your waitress before she even hands you a menu. And if your parents were exhausted from 5 hours of driving with 3 kids in the back seat, Hojo's was the reset button. This was the golden age for roadside America. Howard Johnson's was not just a restaurant. It was a cultural checkpoint, a piece of travel history. You went in knowing what to expect, and in a country where every mile looked a little different, that predictability mattered. Somewhere between the jukebox music, the warm pancakes, and the napkin dispensers, we found a little slice of home off the highway. Chiaparelli perfumes once lived in the same breathless league as Chanel and Dior. With their surrealist bottles and bold floral compositions, they brought high fashion to the dressing tables of everyday American women. It was not just a scent, it was a statement. In the 1970s, Chiaparelli's legacy still lingered, but America was shifting. Fashion was getting younger, louder, and more synthetic. The brand struggled to adapt. Department stores gave shelf space to trendier, punchier names. The old-world elegance of Chiaparelli felt out of step in a decade of disco and denim. And somewhere along the way, the company let go of its American foothold. Licensing fell apart. Distribution waned. What had once been a symbol of European sophistication became something whispered about in vintage shops. Women who once dabbed it on before dinner parties now found their favorite scents discontinued, forgotten. For some, it was just a bottle, but for others, it was identity. A sense of self wrapped in rose and bergamot, and losing that, quietly, without warning, felt like losing a part of the woman they once were. It was not advertised. It was not even on a main road. Just a crooked wooden sign and a driveway that dipped behind an overgrown hedge. But if Dad tapped the wheel twice and said, "Here we are," you knew it was magic. The model train store in the back of someone's garage was no bigger than a single-car stall, but inside, it felt like a kingdom. Shelves were packed to the rafters with tiny train cars, tracks, tunnels, even tiny trees with even tinier squirrels. The air smelled like dust and old metal, the kind of smell that never leaves your coat. You would lean in to watch the train circle a miniature mountain range while Dad made small talk with the gray-haired man in suspenders, who clearly ran the whole operation on nothing but love and nostalgia. "This one's from 1952, the man would say, handing Dad a coal car like it was a rare coin. You did not know what made it special. You just knew Dad's eyes lit up in that way he saved for fishing trips and baseball games. It was not just a store. It was a secret clubhouse for grown men who still believed in toy engines and pretend towns. And if you think that was charming, wait until you smell what comes next. Free popcorn at the furniture store. Family-friendly this, family-oriented that. If you really want to talk about a restaurant that played that game better than anybody else, you can really only mention Antoines. From the streets of New Orleans, Louisiana. Also, stop for a second. Remember how I said Parker's was only the second oldest restaurant? Let me introduce you to the founding date of Antoines, which is literally 1840. By the way, this place was still up and running by the mid-20th century. So yeah, just let that sink in for a bit. It wasn't known for how long of a life it lived, though. It was known for Antoine Alciatore's famous decision to include classic Creole cuisine, which at the time, and even well into the 20th century, nobody else was doing. If they were, they definitely were not doing it on the same scale as Antoine's was. It had multiple dining rooms, and each of them had its own unique aesthetic and deco. And they were very often used for private dining and even parties. It was known as a place for the affluent and the rich to come and live it up, and it had an extensive wine cellar. A lot of qualities that you haven't heard so far, because we've mostly dealt with restaurants specializing in family-friendly food and classic American fast food staples. Antoine's was the biggest proponent of Creole culture, fine eating, good wine, and an extreme focus on carrying your cultural identity into your product, a format that a lot of restaurants are even today trying to nail down perfectly. Sambos restaurant was once everywhere. At its peak, over 1,000 locations dotted the American map, and for a time, it was the breakfast joint. You walked in, saw the tiger stripe motif, and knew pancakes were on the way. The food was solid. Fluffy pancakes, greasy bacon, big mugs of diner coffee. The kind of breakfast that left you needing a nap by 10 in the morning. But Sambo's legacy is tangled. Its name and branding, drawn from a children's book with racist origins, sparked increasing backlash as public awareness and cultural conversations shifted. People started asking hard questions about what a restaurant should represent. The food stayed consistent, but the reputation cracked. One by one, locations closed or rebranded. And while the last original Sambos held on until 2020, even it finally changed names. Still, to many who grew up in its booths, it was not about the name. It was about pancake mornings with family and kids' meals with tiger-striped coloring books. But from syrupy stacks to something a little more British, the next forgotten favorite took a trip across the Atlantic and served up deep-fried nostalgia with a dash of malt vinegar. Roast beef sandwiches can be great, warm, savory, just the right amount of messy. And for a while, Rax was doing a decent job delivering exactly that. But somewhere along the way, it decided to stop being Rax and start being, well, everything else. Jungle themes, salad bars, and a half-hearted attempt to take on Arby's. Spoiler alert, it did not end well. Rax started out strong in the 1970s. It was simple, focused, and had a loyal base. The roast beef was hot, the buns were soft, and the prices were reasonable. People liked it. They did not love it, but they liked it, which is more than you can say for most chains that came and went. Then came the identity crisis. The company tried to reinvent itself into a fast casual experience before that was even a buzzword. Suddenly, locations had ferns, waterfalls, and salad bars. Yes, actual salad bars, with the weirdest mix of items. Some stores even looked like tropical lobbies. People were confused. Was this a roast beef joint or a botanical garden? Worse, the core food started slipping. Quality dipped, menus expanded with no real strategy. The brand lost focus and the customers followed suit. By the time they tried to pivot back to basics, it was already too late. Arby's stayed the course. Rax took a detour into weird and never found the exit. You can still find a few locations here and there, mostly out of nostalgia. But for the most part, Rax became a footnote, a reminder that trying to be everything usually means ending up as nothing. Roast beef deserved better. So did we. Got mall food memories or regrets? Drop a comment, tap like, and subscribe for more tastes of the past.